One of the things I find upsetting is the prevalence of intellectual hedonism within the context of society. And the reason I find this to be upsetting is because intellectual hedonism is a subversion, is a shirking of social responsibility for an intellectual. It shows that a human being is not thinking about the context in which they exist. It shows that they don't care about anything beyond their own subjective amusement. In Hegel's Encyclopedia of Logic, in the second preface, in the beginning, he's talking about his task of writing logic. And he says, "There could be all too many inducements and stimuli present that seem to require that I should declare myself about the external bearing of my philosophical activity upon the cultural concerns of our time, some of which are rich and others poor in spirit, and this can only be done in an exoteric way, as for instance in a preface." What Hegel is talking about here is the idea that he should be engaging in all kinds of cultural subjects in the pursuit of writing his philosophy. He says, "For although these cultural concerns claim some relationship with philosophy for themselves, they do not permit of scientific discussion. So they do not enter into philosophy at all, but carry on their chatter wars from outside and stay outside it." So here, Hegel is thinking of a higher standard of value for his own intellectual pursuit. It's quite exemplary that Hegel is not merely engaged in an intellectual activity that he finds amusing, but an activity that he finds to be important. And here, one of the criteria he uses is that these type of pursuits do not permit of scientific discussion. Now, Hegel's not referring to empirical science here. He's referring to philosophy. He's referring to a logical, ordered, rational process of philosophy. And he's saying that he forgoes these other cultural studies because they do not take heed to this form. He says, "It is inappropriate and even risky to betake oneself to a field that is quite alien to science, since explanations and discussions of that sort do not advance the scientific understanding, which is all that matters for genuine cognition." So here Hegel is concerned with pursuing his task precisely because it's a form of thought that is concerned with expanding thought itself, with understanding the mechanism that leads to progress in society itself. It's so interesting that Hegel has this standard, that he's applying his own activity to a kind of objective criteria and weighing his activity in light of this criteria. Not merely to pursue what amuses him, what catches his interest, but he's engaged in the process of having a disciplined mind, of pursuing something that he discerns to have a higher social value. He says, "The scientific cognition of truth is what I have labored upon and still do labor upon always, in all of my philosophical endeavors. This is the hardest road to travel," he says, "but it is the only one that can be of interest and value for the spirit. Once the spirit embarks upon the way of thought, not the way of religion, the way of thought without tumbling into vanity upon that road, but maintaining the will and the courage for the truth. As I said, exemplary. Here Hegel demonstrates a higher way, where he has actually asked the question of value in relation to his content, in relation to his intellectual activity. When he says that this is the hardest road to travel, but is the only one that can be of interest and value for the spirit, he's not talking about a phantom. He's not talking about a mysticism. He's talking about the collective consciousness of mankind. He's talking about the development of this consciousness. He's talking about being able to function at the cutting edge, at the highest pinnacle of the development of the transmission of human consciousness. That's what he's referring to by this notion of spirit. And he talks about this spirit not tumbling into vanity upon the road. And that's precisely what we're referring to when we refer to intellectual hedonism. Getting caught up in these pursuits that amuse us, but we have not asked the question as to what their social value is. What value do they have beyond the fact that they amuse us subjectively? I hold to the position that intellectuals and thinkers in general should be asking beyond this. We should be pursuing the question of the value of our activities, of the value of our intellectual life. We should not merely gauge that life on the basis of whether or not it amuses us. If we do that, then we find that the pursuits that we are engaging in are irrelevant and that they have no value. I think that we are perhaps afraid of this question. We're afraid to ask this question because we're afraid it will shatter the pursuits that we are engaged in, and it will demand that we go in a different direction. We take a different path. And that is most likely the case. Asking the question of value will revolutionize an individual's life. What is it that has value? I want to read analytical philosophy per se, but what's the value of analytical philosophy? Sociology has a much higher value than analytical philosophy. Psychology has a much higher value, more relevant than analytical philosophy. So, being engaged in this courageous act of asking the question of what has value within the domain of our intellectual lives so that we do not waste our lives, we do not waste our energy, we do not waste our powers. What is it that has higher value? As I have asked this question, my mind has indeed ended up in the domain of psychology, in the domain of sociology, in the domain of politics. Why politics? Because politics govern life. They restrict life. Through politics comes legislation. And through legislation, human bodies, human speech, society itself is regulated, restricted, or expanded into freedom. Politics are exceedingly relevant because they sit at the foundation of all kinds of stuff within the social order. If politics wants to pass legislation to restrain funding for education, then society is regressed because there is not enough funding to pursue public education to support public education. And so politics is a kind of power over the species. It's important that we begin to think in terms of these power structures, in terms of relevance and in terms of value. What is it that we are pursuing? Could we be pursuing something that has greater value? Could we be pursuing something that is more relevant? Where are our particular talents, our particular skills, our particular energy, where does that best fit in? And we are fools, I believe, if we run away from our strengths. We should try to build our strengths and then channel those strengths toward relevance, toward value. So it's very exemplary that one of the greatest philosophers that ever lived was not merely engaged in the pursuit of intellectual hedonism, but he was engaged in asking the prior question, the question of value, the question of relevance, because he didn't want to waste his time. Intelligence has to figure out what has value and then dedicate itself to pursuing and following that path in the hope that it can maybe expand that value.